In 2015, a geneticist named Katarzyna Bryc sat down with the DNA of nearly 150,000 Americans. She wasn't hunting for scandal. She was mapping ancestry, state by state. But when she narrowed the data to white Southerners, to people in South Carolina and Louisiana who had marked themselves white and nothing else, the genome told her something their family Bibles never had. A piece of West Africa was sitting in their chromosomes. It wasn't supposed to be there. And it was only the first thing the Deep South's DNA had been keeping quiet. For most of the last century, the Deep South was explained with two populations: British settlers on one side, enslaved Africans on the other. Two streams, one tragic history, and a color line drawn hard between them. It is a clean story. It is also wrong, or at least badly incomplete, and the genome has spent the last decade quietly proving it. Start with the backbone, the people who built the White South. They were not simply English. The largest single thread running through Appalachia and the southern backcountry came out of Ulster in the north of Ireland. These were the Scots-Irish, lowland Scots, whom the English crown had planted in Ireland back in the early 1600s under James I. They were Presbyterian, stubborn, and poor. Many of them had been border people before they were Ulster people, out of the violent frontier between Scotland and England, and they carried that hard frontier temperament into the American backcountry. And by the early 1700s, after rising rents and bad harvests, they began to leave Ulster for America in numbers that are hard to picture. Between 1717 and the Revolution, more than 250,000 of them crossed the Atlantic. Their ships landed at Philadelphia and Newcastle. From there, they did not stay in the north. They turned south down a single artery called the Great Wagon Road, through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, into the Carolina backcountry, and on into the mountains of East Tennessee and North Georgia. They were usually the first Europeans into those valleys. They brought the Presbyterian church, the ballad, the fiddle tune, and a way of speaking that linguists still hear in the hollows today. You can read them in the surnames: the McCoys and the Hatfields, the Crockett's, the Calhouns, the Boones, the Jacksons. Andrew Jackson's parents were Ulster immigrants. So the founding stock of the White South was Scots-Irish and English, with German Lutherans and others layered in along the frontier. That part of the story is true, and the DNA confirms it cleanly. A northwestern European signal, heavy on the British Isles, runs straight through the region. But here is where the official two-population story starts to crack. Because that same backbone, those same self-described white Southern families, were not as genetically separate from the other half of the story as the color line pretended. The line on the census form was a legal fiction. The genome never agreed to it. And when researchers finally had enough Southern DNA to look closely, the thing that surprised them most was how much of one population was hiding inside the other. To see how entangled it really was, go back to Bryc's study, published in January 2015 in the American Journal of Human Genetics. She and her co-authors, including the Harvard geneticist David Bryc, analyzed more than 160,000 people who had tested with the company 23andMe. 5,000 of them were African American. Almost 150,000 identified as white. And the averages they found should be read slowly. The average African American genome in that study was just over 73% African, about 24% European, and under 1% Native American. Sit with that European figure. Nearly a quarter. For most African American families, that European DNA traces back to the plantation, to the simple and brutal fact that the people who owned human beings also fathered children by them. The genome records it without comment. The European contribution comes overwhelmingly down the male line. The African contribution comes down the female line. That asymmetry is the shape of the history itself, written into the chromosomes. And that African ancestry is not generic. When researchers trace it, roughly half of it points to one region, the Niger-Congo heartland of the Yoruba, in what is now southern Nigeria and Benin, the epicenter of the transatlantic trade. The next largest piece is, of all things, British, the European admixture folded in over the same centuries. The average African American genome is, in a sense, a map of the slave coast and the plantation both. Now turn the same data around, and you reach the finding that unsettled people the most. If Black Southerners carried European ancestry, did white Southerners carry African ancestry? They did, quietly, in small amounts, far more often than anyone admitted. Across the country, Bryc found that roughly 3 to 4% of self-identified white Americans carried at least 1% African ancestry. But the South was different. In South Carolina, that figure rose to as much as 13%. In Louisiana, a little over 12%. In Georgia and Alabama, around 9%. 1 in 8, or 1 in 11, depending on the state. People who had marked themselves white, whose families had always been white, carrying a measurable thread of West Africa. What does 1% actually mean? The researchers estimated that 1% African ancestry points to a single African ancestor somewhere in roughly the last 6 generations. About 200 years, which lands you squarely in the era of slavery and tells you exactly how it happened. Somewhere back up the line, a person of mixed ancestry was light enough to cross over, to be recorded as white, to marry white, raise white children, and let the rest go unspoken. Genealogists have a cold word for it: passing. The genome is the part of the family that never learned to keep the secret. The same study found something that exposes the color line as pure invention. Most people whose DNA came back more than a quarter African, up to 28% African, still identified as white rather than black. The label on the form and the proportion in the blood had come unmoored from each other entirely, and the authors singled out Louisiana, tying its unusually high European ancestry to the documented history of New Orleans, and to placage, the formal system of relationships between European men and free women of color that ran for generations in the city. And it ran both directions at the edges. The most African-rooted population in the entire study was not in Africa. It was off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, in the Gula Geechee communities of the Sea Islands. Descendants of Rice Coast captives isolated on the islands for generations, they came back as little as 3 to 4% European. They kept a Creole language, a foodway, and a continuity of African culture the mainland could not. On one set of islands, the deepest African inheritance in America. A short boat ride inland, white families carrying a hidden percentage of that very same ancestry. Same coast, same 200 years, one color line drawn straight down the middle of a single extended family. So the West African layer was never confined to one side of the South. But there is another ancestry Southern families talk about constantly, one that shows up in almost every family story, and almost never in the DNA. Ask a Southern family where their cheekbones come from, or their dark hair, or that one grandmother in the sepia photograph, and you will hear the same answer across the whole region. Cherokee. A Cherokee great-grandmother, or a Choctaw, or a Creek. Often a Cherokee princess, though the Cherokee never had princesses. It is one of the most widespread family traditions in America, and it is one of the most reliably disproven things in the entire field of genetic genealogy. The numbers are stark. In Bryc's data, only about 5% of African Americans carried as much as 2% Native American ancestry. The average was under 1%, less than a single percent. And among white Southerners, the native signal is usually thinner still. Family after family takes a DNA test, certain they will find the Cherokee grandmother, and the test comes back with British, Irish, and a trace of West Africa, and no detectable Native American at all. More Americans claim Cherokee ancestry than there are enrolled Cherokee, by a wide margin. It is at once the most claimed and the least confirmed ancestry in the country. Why is the myth so durable? Look at what it was doing. For a black family, claiming a native ancestor explained straight hair and lighter skin, with a story that carried dignity, instead of the painful truth of the plantation. For a white family, a Cherokee great-grandmother explained a darker complexion or an unusual feature with an ancestry that was romantic and American rather than African, which under Southern law could cost you your land, your marriage, your freedom. The Cherokee grandmother was often a gentler name for an African one. It worked less like a lie and more like a shield. There is one real exception, and it proves the rule. The state where African Americans genuinely do carry significant Native ancestry is Oklahoma, and that traces to the Trail of Tears when the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other nations were forcibly marched west into Indian territory, taking enslaved black people with them, and to the generations of mixing that followed in that specific documented place. Where the history actually happened, the DNA is there. Where it is only family legend, it usually is not. So the Native American story of the South turns out to be mostly a story about something else. A cover, a comfort, a way of not saying a harder word. But not every strange family tradition in the South was a cover for African ancestry. Up in the mountains, along one stretch of the Tennessee and Virginia line, there was a group of families whose story was so peculiar that no one, not the neighbors, not the census takers, not the families themselves, could agree on what they actually were. They had been arguing about it for 200 years. In 2012, DNA finally answered. If this is the kind of history you came for, subscribe. This channel digs into the real genetics beneath Anglo and American ancestry every week, the sourced version, never the hype. Now, to those families in the mountains. They were called Melungeons. The name was a slur before it was anything else, pinned in the early 1800s on a cluster of about 40 families living along the ridges where Tennessee meets Virginia, Hancock County, Hawkins County, Lee County across the state line. They were dark-complexioned. They were not quite anything the law had a box for, and they had clearly been there a long time. Neither white, nor black, nor recognizably native, in a society that demanded you be exactly one of those three. So the explanations multiplied. Some said the Melungeons were descended from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors. Some said Turkish slaves left behind by Sir Francis Drake. Some said survivors of the vanished Roanoke colony, or Phoenicians, or one of the lost tribes of Israel. The families themselves usually held to one answer above all others. We are Portuguese. They said it for generations, on documents, in court, to their own children. And there was a reason they said it so insistently, which we will come back to because it turns out to be the most revealing part of the whole story. In 2012, a team led by the genetic genealogist Roberta Estes, working with the historians Jack Goins, Janet Crain, and Penny Ferguson, published the answer in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy. The paper was titled plainly, Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population. They had spent years running the core Melungeon DNA project, testing the direct paternal and maternal lines of documented Melungeon families, families with recurring names like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, and Bunch. 69 male lines, 8 female lines. And the result was not Portugal, and it was not Turkey, and it was not a lost colony. The male lines, the Y chromosomes passed father to son, were dominated by haplogroup E1b1a. That is a sub-Saharan African signature. The female lines, the mitochondrial DNA passed mother to daughter, were European. Put plainly, the original Melungeon families were the children of African men and European women. The paternal side came out roughly half European and half African. The maternal side was European across the board. There was no direct Native American line in the core families at all, despite centuries of assuming there must be. And the timeline the DNA pointed to is the quietly astonishing part. These unions did not happen on a plantation. They happened earlier, in the mid-1600s, in colonial Virginia, in places like Louisa County, in the brief window before slavery hardened into something permanent and racial. In that window, African and European indentured servants lived and worked and married side by side. Their mixed descendants were free people. But as Virginia wrote race into law, criminalizing those marriages, narrowing what a free person of color could own or do, those families had one option left. They pulled together, married among themselves, and moved. Out of the Virginia tidewater, down through the Carolinas, and up into the most defensible ground they could find, the Appalachian Mountains, where the law had a harder time reaching. And the Portuguese story? That was the shield. In a world where being black, or even a free person of color, could strip you of your land and your rights, claiming to be Portuguese meant claiming to be European. It meant claiming to be white. That was not vanity. It was survival, passed down so long and so well that the descendants came to believe it themselves. In an 1874 Tennessee inheritance case, a Melungeon woman named Martha Simmerman stood to lose everything if a court decided she had African blood. The whole community's insistence on Portugal had a courtroom logic behind it. The genome simply outlived the argument. The Melungeons hid an African inheritance inside a European story. But the Deep South was hiding surprising European threads too, ones that had nothing to do with the British Isles' backbone at all. And the clearest of them speaks French. In 1685, the French King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, the law that had protected France's Protestant minority. Overnight, being a Protestant in France became a crime. Hundreds of thousands of them, called Huguenots, fled, and a stream of them landed at one particular American port, Charleston, South Carolina, in the 1680s and 90s. They were not field hands. They were silk makers, winemakers, goldsmiths, and above all, merchants. And the English colony wanted them badly. Within 2 or 3 generations, they had married into the planter elite and largely stopped speaking French. But they left their names stamped across the South Carolina Low Country, where you can still read them on the map today. Ravenel, Manigault, a family out of the great Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle, Huger, Horry, Gallard, Mazick, Laurens, as in Henry Laurens, who would become president of the Continental Congress, and Marion, as in Francis Marion, the swamp fox of the Revolution, whose grandfather had fled France for his faith. Their church still stands on Church Street in Charleston, the French Huguenot church, the last of its kind, still independent in the country. So, the genome of a so-called old white Charleston family is not a simple British reading. It carries a distinct French Protestant layer, a thread of people who arrived as refugees and ended up at the very top of Southern society. Layered alongside them were German Protestants in the Carolina and Georgia backcountry, and a Jewish merchant community in Charleston that founded one of the oldest synagogues in the country, Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, in 1749. Down in Louisiana, Spain settled islanders from the Canary Islands, the Islenos, whose descendants in St. Bernard Parish kept an old Spanish dialect alive into living memory. No single one of these threads is the point. The White South was never one people. It was a braid, and the DNA can still pick the strands apart. Which brings us back to where we started, and to what all of this actually means for the family Bible, and for the cheek swab sitting in your bathroom drawer. Put the layers together, and the real genetic map of the Deep South looks nothing like the two-population story. There is the Scots-Irish and English backbone, the founding stock that came down the Great Wagon Road and gave the region its surnames, its churches, and its speech. There is the West African inheritance, carried not on one side of the color line, but on both, because the line was a law, not a fact of biology, and the people it tried to separate were often the same family. There is the French Protestant layer in the Low Country, refugees who became aristocrats. There are the Melungeons, an African and European people who survived by becoming a mystery. And there is the Native American story, which lives enormous in family memory and small in the genome, except in the few places where the history was real. What ties all of it together is concealment. Almost every one of these threads was hidden on purpose, and for the same reason. In the South, your ancestry was not just a curiosity, it was a legal status. It decided whether you could own land, who you could marry, whether you were free. So people edited their own origins to stay safe. A grandmother became Cherokee instead of African. A family became Portuguese instead of mixed. A line crossed over and was simply recorded as white. The records burned, the stories were smoothed, the hard words went unsaid. For 2 centuries, it worked, but it does not work on a chromosome. This is the part that matters if you have already spit in the tube and gotten your results back, or if you are about to. When your test shows a small West African percentage your family never mentioned, or no trace of the Cherokee ancestor everyone swore by, you are looking at the cover story finally breaking. The genome is the one witness that was present for all of it, that had no stake in the family's version, and that cannot be talked out of what it remembers. That is what Katarzyna Bryc was really reading in 2015, and what Roberta Estes was reading in those mountain bloodlines in 2012. Something larger than Ancestry, a record of who the South was underneath who it claimed to be. And it turns out the South was richer, more tangled, and more human than the official 2 columns ever allowed. None of this should diminish anyone's heritage. If anything, it deepens it. The white Southern family with a thread of West Africa, the black Southern family with a quarter of Europe, the mountain family that was never Portuguese, the Charleston name that began as a refugee, are all carrying a fuller and more honest history than the one on the courthouse shelf. The DNA did not erase those stories. It restored the parts that fear had removed. If your own surname turned up anywhere in this video, tell us in the comments where your family swore they came from and what your DNA test actually said. We read them. And if you want the next investigation into the real bloodlines beneath the American story, told with the sources on the table, stay with us. The record is still talking. We are just learning how to listen.